So today we're going to go over wrist, elbow, and radial ulnar joint. In that, I'm going to introduce you to all three. I'm going to go into more detail in the next few classes, but I'm trying this new approach because there's so many allusions to these three joints that I think it's important for us to at least differentiate what is wrist, what is elbow, and what is radial. Like just that in itself needs to be a level of understanding, because so many times when I'm going over these exams and these questions, students like, oh, I thought this was this, I thought this was that. It makes sense. There's some confusing things with the wrist, radial, and elbow. Okay. So the wrist, you're going to hear me say this a lot, but write it down. To me, it's important. The wrist joint itself, the wrist doesn't twist. Copyright Brian J. Campbell, 2006. The wrist doesn't twist. It's a biaxial ellipsoid joint that moves in sagittal and frontal, but it does not move in transverse. It doesn't. It can't. So a lot of times when you think that you're rotating your wrist, look up one sec, guys. When you're doing this, this isn't your wrist. This is your radial ulnar joint. In fact, it should make sense because your wrist joint's up here, right? But when I do this, you can see my clothes move on my forearm. That should make sense. If I'm just moving my wrist, it should just be motion up here, right? But people, in layman's terms, like elbow, wrist, or like in the Queens and the this is not wrist. You may see globally the front of your wrist go from front to back, but if you tried to stabilize your forearm and just twist your wrist joint, it's not going anywhere in the transverse plane. Does that make sense? It can move sagittally, it can move frontally, but it cannot move transversely. And it should also make sense. Why? Because this area of your wrist, we have to, and maybe you've been introduced to this in a previous class, which is really great. We have so much wiring in our hands, like the nerves, not like, oh, they have the nerve, but like the nerves that we need, the ratio, so many neuron to muscle fibers so that we could do all these intricate little detailed tasks. We have unbelievably intricate plumbing that crosses our wrist joint. And that doesn't include the plumbing for our arteries and our veins. The nerves that we have that run through here is incredible. So the last thing we would want is for our wrists to rotate around like a balloon animal, as you twist the balloon. If we were able to twist this around, that would be a really, really bad day for all of our plumbing and our wiring. So we want to maintain all of those nerves and vessels that run through our wrist. So we don't want our wrist to twist in the transverse plane. Does that make sense? Okay. So before we get into the specific motions, I just have to differentiate. Wrist motion is going to happen at the wrist joint. It's going to look like this, and side to side. Okay. The elbow and radial ulnar joint are two separate joints that live in the same apartment complex. We have precedents for this, ankle and subtalar, right? Didn't the ankle and subtalar joint live in the same? They call it a capsule, but it's basically a water balloon of ligaments. So like those individual ligaments that we know about, like the lateral, collateral, or the anterior, those are just thickened bands of the capsular ligament that kind of engulfs each joint, fills it with synovial fluid. I call it water balloons, okay? But they're a lot stronger than water balloons. So you have a similar concept where you have one water balloon that encapsulates the elbow and this other joint called the radial ulnar joint. So the elbow is going to do what elbow things do, uniaxial hinge, in the fetal, out of fetal. But this is the joint that gives my students the most issue to understand. How the radius rotates about the ulna. Okay. Again, they live in the same water balloon. They live in the same apartment complex, but they're not in the same apartment. Okay. This is the magic to how we can get our hand up from down. It's not the wrist. It's literally taking everything that's attached to the radius and flipping it prone or flipping it supine. And I know you guys have heard that term before, right? Prone and supine. What is supine? On your back, and prone is on your tummy, right? Face down or face up. So I'm going to teach you that pronation and supination has nothing to do with making a soup bowl. And the reason I don't teach that is because that's a global reference. It's about, am I going prone or am I going supine? Because when you're on top of your head, prone is actually making the soup bowl up to, you're actually prone in this position. Because if I extend my shoulder, I'm in the same position as when I do this. Think of it like this. If I had a spoon and the spoon was like this, everybody see that? Spoon doesn't rotate. But if I take the spoon and do this with it, well, now you see the back of the spoon. You went from seeing the front to seeing the back. So again, fronts and backs and ups and downs can only get us into trouble when we're talking about relative to the bones in our body. Okay, so pronation and supination is going to be a radial-ulnar joint concept. And the radial-ulnar joint is how the radius rotates about the ulna. What's really neat, and this is how the magic gets worked, this is how the magic happens, is because all of the carpal bones are attached to the radius. When the radius flips over, everything on the hand and the wrist goes with it. Does that make sense? Because the wrist is attached to the radius, when the radius rotates about the ulna, everything goes along with it. Which again, super convenient for us, for our functional circle of grip, without having to spin the wrist joint and risk damaging nerves and vessels. And we can have our cake and eat it too. Okay. So the three main articulational joints for the next couple days: the wrist, biaxial, that means it can move about two of its axes, two of its planes. So how many motions are we going to have to account for? 4. Outstanding. And understanding that this isn't wrist. That's one of the biggest traps. This is not wrist motion. Radial-ulnar joint. It's a uniaxial pivot joint. Pivot is like atlas axis. It's specialized to rotate. It's specialized to rotate about its long axis. It's a spinning joint. So that's different than a uniaxial hinge that's meant for general motion. In other words, it rotates too, but it also moves stuff with it. Pivot joints are like revolving doors. You ever see the revolving door like in Elf, where he's just going around and around and around? It's a spinning door, not like a traditional door that moves its center of mass with its rotation. Okay? Pivot joints. And then finally, the elbow is a traditional hinge joint. A lot of illusions, but we're going to go through them. Okay? So let's start off. First of all, any questions about me setting the stage for the importance of differentiating what is wrist, what is elbow, and what is radial-ulnar? That's important. Okay, that is important. And the radial-ulnar may look different. Like my wrist is an anatomical, but my wrist could be flexed and I could still move my radial-ulnar joint. It doesn't matter. My radius is still rotating about my ulna. So it's going to look a lot of different ways, because everything that's attached to it is going to go along for the ride. So there's going to be a lot of illusions there. But guys, I'm going to teach you landmarks. I'm going to teach you rules that will always apply. But what we just can't do is do the soup bowl thing, because that's going to get you in trouble. Okay? I'm not saying it can't be right, but it's only right in that one scenario And we're going to see there's a lot of different scenarios that it doesn't have to always be correct in human movement, okay? All right, let's talk about the wrist. For this class, all you have to do is know that it's articulated with the distal or the furthest away, right? Proximal is closer to, distal is further away. So the radius, mostly, the ulna is there as well as technically an articulation because there's ligaments and stuff. But in terms of the actual motion, it's mostly about the radius. So it's your carpal bones, scaphoid, lunate, and your radius. I'm not going to ask you that on the test. You just have to know that your carpal bones are moving mostly about your radius. Okay. Sagittal plane, this is nothing new. You guys had this on the first test, right? In the fetal, out of fetal. Okay. So we're going to have wrist flexion and wrist extension. One of the easiest, in my opinion, cheat codes is because the wrist doesn't twist or the wrist doesn't rotate. Follow the fingers. The finger flexion, fingers getting in the fetal, the finger flexion will always show you the wrist flexion. Follow the fingers to flexion. Okay? So what I mean by that is if I'm in anatomical position, wrist flexion may be hand goes forward. You know, we don't like that word, right? Because I can also rotate my radius about my ulna. Well, now you're seeing the back of my hand. Wrist flexion could be my fingers go back. Does that make sense? But in the first case, follow the fingers. Fingers will show me the flexion. Follow the fingers will show me the flexion. Does that make sense? Okay, so follow the fingers to flexion, to wrist flexion. And again, that only works because the wrist can't twist. If the wrist could rotate in its transverse plane, then that rule wouldn't exist, right? Because I could rotate my wrist and then the finger flexion would be wrist extension. But because the wrist doesn't rotate in the transverse plane, the fingers will always line up with the wrist flexion. Cool? Follow the fingers. So I could have wrist flexion like this, bilateral wrist flexion. I could have wrist flexion like this, bilateral wrist flexion. I could have wrist flexion like this, bilateral wrist flexion. I could have wrist flexion like this, bilateral wrist flexion. I could have wrist flexion like this, bilateral wrist flexion. So there's no rule that it has to look a certain way. But in all of those cases, if you follow the fingers, it'll show you the flexion. Does that make sense? So the extension of the fingers will show you the extension of the wrist, regardless of the radial ulnar joint position. Does that make sense? Okay. Wrist flexion and wrist extension. So for the wrist, we could have flexion from anatomical, we could have extension to anatomical, we could have extension from, we have flexion to first test stuff. But on this test, I just want you to know that that flexion and extension can happen in a myriad of elbow positions, radial ulnar joint positions. But remember, since we analyze motion joint by joint, the wrist doesn't care what position my elbow's in. The wrist doesn't care what position my radial ulnar joint's in. My wrist is like, dude, I'm either flexing or I'm extending. I don't see or know what's happening outside of my water balloon. That makes sense? Okay. So what would something like this be? Let's do our first little check your knowledge. I start here and I do this. What would my wrist do? Feel free to do it. Look, I'll start off here, hands together, and I go, I'm now pointing to my left. So you would point your fingers that way. We analyze motion joint by joint. We do not assume. Did both wrists do the same thing?
No.
Very good. Do you see how easy it would be for an untrained person to be like, well, they had to do the same thing. They're pointing in the same direction, aren't they? You see where these traps can come from? Okay. So if they didn't do the same thing, I have to ask, well, who did what? My left wrist had extension and my right wrist had outstanding, because we don't assume. It would be so easy to just say they both did the same thing. Does that make sense? So if I started here and I came back, left wrist had flexion, right wrist had extension. Cool. Okay. Any questions or clarifications? And this is what's happening. Actually, this would be a left. So my left would be doing this. Extended. Flexed. Follow the fingers, guys. Follow the fingers. Okay. Now, frontal plane of the wrist. Frontal plane of the wrist. We don't have the term ab and adduction for the wrist. I think there's a couple reasons why I didn't write these things. But I think there's a couple reasons why. I think one of the reasons is because we don't have the horizontal version of it, because the wrist is, when you're flexed or extended, your wrist kind of, they call it a closed pack position, but when you're flexed or extended, your wrist kind of secures its position more than when you're in anatomical. In other words, when you're in anatomical, you could travel down the four roads, but when you're flexed or extended, the ligaments and the tight muscles kind of lock it into place, and you can't really, which makes sense, because like if you're pushing on things or doing bench press, you don't want your wrist to move a lot, right? You want it to be kind of cemented in place. Your ankle does a similar thing when you're dorsiflex. So when you're in an extended position or flexed position, you don't really have any motion side to side, because you want to be stable, secure, strong. When you're in anatomical, though, you can move in the wrist's frontal plane, possessive frontal plane. So before I tell you these motions, I want it to make sense. Because the wrist does, you keep hearing me say this, because the wrist doesn't twist, that means that the radial side, or the radius, will always and forever be thumb side. It can't, because the thumb can't rotate to the ulna. Does that make sense? Thumb side will always be radial side, and pinky side will always be ulna side. And that's because the wrist can't transverse rotate. So watch what happens. Thumb side, pinky side, radius, ulna. Watch this. Thumb side is still radial side, and pinky side is still ulna side. Now, when I say radial and ulna side, I'm talking about the distal radius and ulna. The proximal isn't going to go anywhere. The proximal is still, the analogy that I like to give is that if you are laying, you're sleeping, and let's say at my age, my back starts to hurt when I lay down for too long. And so I'll change position. So I may keep my head on my pillow, but I may rotate my body over to the other side. So my head stays on the pillow, but my body can move across the bed. Does that make sense? So it's very similar. The head of the radius stays in the same position, but the body of the radius can kind of flop over to the other side. So when I say thumb side is radial side, I'm talking about the distal radius, not the proximal radius. I'm talking about down here. It's the same side as the body that would be flopping around. Okay. Thumb side will always be radial side, distal radius. This little bony notch is called the radial styloid. It's where some muscles attach. But here's my thumb, here's the distal part of my radius. When I pronate, there's the distal part of my radius. There's my thumb. They have to stay together. Pinky is always going to be ulna side. This is my ulna styloid process. Notice how these two will always stay together. Okay? That being said, our motions for our radial ulnar joint in the frontal plane are ulnar deviation and radial deviation. Pinky side, thumb side. Deviating towards the ulna, deviating towards the radius. Pinky side, thumb side. And there's no exceptions. If I'm here, I had bilateral bilateral wrist ulnar deviation. They deviated to the pinky side. But watch how confusing it could be if we don't get these rules in place. If I rotate my radial ulnar joint on my left, this would be bilateral ulnar deviation. This would be bilateral radial deviation. Pinky side for both, thumb side for both. Make sense? Pinky side for both, thumb side for both. Pinky side, thumb side. Pinky side, thumb side. Pinky side, thumb side. It's gonna be tough. Pinky side, thumb side. Okay, make sense? Any questions? So it looks like it's moving, and it is. When the illusions come around, that's usually for our functional circles of like function. Functional circles of function. Nice, candle, double negative. But like if you were gonna lift up something with a neutral wrist just means like you're mostly in anatomical position. And let's say you wanted to lift it up, but you didn't want to spill, wouldn't you probably do some ulnar deviation? Because if my wrist stayed in anatomical, I might be pouring water back, right? So when you're working with tools, when you're working with gripping things and moving things, look how that ulnar deviation really kind of helps keep your grip and keep things level while you're trying to influence it and move it, okay? Typically when your joint has more motion, what you gain in mobility, you lose in stability and vice versa. So we have a lot more ulnar deviation than radial deviation, which makes sense because most of the time when we grab things, we're gonna kind of be in this semi-prone position. And it makes sense that we're gonna probably be working or handling things more like this than like that. Or think about the extra motion when like you're doing a function like hammering in a hammer, like to get that last whip, right? That ulnar deviation, more motion, hitting the hammer, bang, bang. Okay. So ulnar and radial deviation. Those are wrist motions. All right, let's get to radial ulnar joint. Radial ulnar joint is the radius going prone or supine about the ulna. Going prone, so in anatomical position, think of anatomical position as the radius is supine in anatomical position. To me, that's a cleaner way of saying it. In anatomical position, the radius is laying on the bed, supine, face up, okay? When the radius goes prone and it starts to rotate to go in a face down position, notice how the head stays in the same place, but the body rotates over the ulna, crisscross. This allows us a very unique landmark to kind of see if we're supine or we're prone. Proximal, does everybody understand proximal and distal? Proximal is closer to, distal is further away. Proximal radius, distal radius. Proximal ulna, distal ulna. When you are supine, everything lines up. Proximal is lateral, distal is lateral. We talked about what medial and lateral means, right? Lateral more on the outside, medial more on the inside. It's a term we have so that we could say a side of a side. We already have two sides, a right and a left arm, but I can't say the right of my right and the left of my right, because the left of my right has the same structures as the right of my left. So we have to have this mirror effect to say medial and lateral, so that the same structures that are on the right side match up with the same structures that are on the left side. Okay, just a quick reminder. So watch this, how cool, guys. In anatomical position, lateral is going to be my proximal radius, and lateral will be my distal radius. But when I pronate or go in a prone position, lateral will still be my proximal radius, but the distal radius is now medial. That's like saying this: if I was laying on my bed and I flopped over and threw my feet to the other side, but I kept my head on the pillow, my feet went from being on the right side of the bed to being on the left side of the bed, but my head's still in the same place. My head's still on the right side of the bed. Does that make sense? That's all that's happening. So what I'm saying is that when you are in anatomical position, your thumb, because remember, the thumb represents the radial side, right? Your thumb will be lateral. But when you're prone, your thumb is going to be medial. Guys, there's no exceptions to that rule. If you have an exception to that rule, you had a dislocation, and that's a bad day. The fact that your thumb is now medial means that your radius had to flop over and bring the feet to the other side of the bed. Does that make sense? Yes, sir. Okay, good. Just want to make sure. Try it. And what you'll see is when you go prone or supine, your wrist isn't necessarily just moving, your whole forearm is moving. You can feel the motion. Everybody take your left hand and put it over the meaty part of your right arm and pronate and supinate. You'll feel the motion happening in there. I hope you do. Does that make sense? Because that motion is literally the radius wrapping or unwrapping. When the radius is wrapping itself about the ulna, I left out the other part, that on the bed, I have a partner. My wife is right here. She stays still when she sleeps. I wish I could stay still when I sleep. So when we're laying down, side by side, we're in a supine position. But when I wrap my body around my partner, now I'm in a prone position. Does that make sense? And then immediately she supinates me because it's late. You see what's happening here? The radial head stays on the pillow. It's the rest of the body that flops over. It's kind of cool. When the thumb is medial, we are prone. We're face down. And when the thumb is lateral, we are supine. We are face up. Can it look a lot of different ways? Absolutely. Thanks to our wrist, it can look like this. Thanks to our elbow, it can look like this. I'm going to show you, not today, but some really cool illusions that our radial ulnar joint will move with our shoulders to help keep our grip underneath the bar. How many of you have done upright row exercises, right? Okay. Check this out. You start off, me and my props. I had a whole new set of props in here. It's going to be so silly. When you start off, wouldn't you say that I am prone? Right? Okay. If I stayed prone, when I would lift this up, this would happen. Think about it. If I stay prone, the bar would now be under my thumbs and not under my fingers. When I started, the bar was under my fingers, right? So if I stayed prone, this is what would happen. So what do I have to do while I row? Supinate. Now, I don't do it one after the other. I do it at the same time. And the fact that I do it at the same time makes it hard to see. So those are going to be the kind of things we're going to work on over the next few days, is for you to be able to tell, maybe you won't be able to see it directly, but you're going to know the clues. You're going to say, hey, my thumb started medial. I'm wrapped here. And now my thumb is lateral. I'm unwrapped. And the only way I could go from being prone to being supine is to have supination. When I do something like this, where do you think the illusion comes from? You want to see pronation, supination like this, but I think I've established by now that these motions don't have to look traditional. They can look untraditional. Get it? Okay, so that's what's coming. That's what's coming. All right, let's do this one. This is going to be on the test. So why not start today? Put your hand, if you're willing and able, put your hand on top of your head, palm touching your head. From here, make your palm touch the ceiling. Now try to figure out, using the clues that I told you about your thumb being medial or lateral, try to figure out whether you had pronation or supination. Don't answer it out loud because I want everybody to give it some thought. You start with your palm down, and then you finish with your palm up. Try to use the clues that I just taught you about thumb side and pinky side, and try to figure out if you can prove whether that was right or left radial ulnar joint pronation or supination. Give it some thought. Y'all digging the new classroom? No. I know, it's so weird. It's so weird. It's so weird. This is definitely not a classroom for people with claustrophobia. It's kind of packed. I like 153B. It's kind of, you're now free to move about the country. It's got room to breathe. Okay? Is my thumb lateral or medial when I started? Remember, I'm not even asking you to tell me the motion. I'm showing you how I see it. Because I don't trust myself. I don't trust my eyes. My eyes play tricks on me too many times. I trust my knowledge in the clues. Is my thumb medial or lateral? Watch what I do here, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Is my thumb medial or lateral? Lateral. Medial or lateral? Medial. How does the thumb go lateral to medial? What do I have to have? Pronation. I had right radial ulnar joint pronation. And that's why we don't do soup bowls in this class. Because too many times people are like, but you have a soup bowl up here. I'm like, that's awesome. I could have a soup bowl like this. Doesn't make it any less of a soup bowl. Does that make sense? Any questions about that specific example? Do you see how we use position change to infer motion? Stuff we've been doing on the first test. Where am I at? Where did I go? How did I have to move to get there? I started off being supine. Next, I ended up being prone. And the only way to get there is to have pronation, the act of going prone for the radius about the ulna. Cool? You had a question?
Yeah, is it safe to say for this joint, for pronation, the thumb will always be medial, and for supination, it'll always be lateral?
Yes, but yes. However, I want to clarify some little semantics. It's safe to say that when you're in a prone position, your thumb will always be medial. When you're in a supine position, your thumb will always be lateral. And the reason I'm saying that semantically is that this is medial, right? I can have pronation to midway and my thumb hasn't tipped over, right?
Okay.
So, but it's the act of trying to go medial. So I can have pronation and my thumb technically isn't medial yet. And I could have supination, like I could have supination to midway. And I'm going to teach y'all about these things on next class. That midway, we have a specific position for that we call a semi-pronated position. And the reason it's semi-pronated and not semi-supinated is because anatomical position is here. So to get to that position, you have to have pronation. If anatomical position was here, we'd call this a semi-supinated. So if I'm pronated, thumb has to be medial. If I'm supinated all the way, thumb has to be lateral. And when I say pronated, if I'm pronated all the way, right? Because technically I could be pronated 5 degrees, 10 degrees, right? So if I'm pronated from midway, my thumb has to be medial. But that midway is what might get people, because I'm still in a pronated position of 90 degrees, but my thumb hasn't. That would be like I'm laying in my bed and I'm prone. I'm supine. What if I was just laying on my side? Like my feet haven't gone over to the other side of the bed, right? I'm kind of laying on my side. That would be a semi-prone position.
Okay.
Or if some of you have ever done spine boarding before, like you would take the person and you would rotate them 90 degrees on their side while you put the spine board. So you wouldn't put them in a prone position, you'd put them in a semi-prone position while you lay the spine board, and you supinate them too. Great question. Any other follow-up questions on? One of the reasons this can be so confusing is because for our function, we use wrist, elbow, and radial ulnar joint a lot in the things we do. A lot of wrist, radial ulnar joint, and elbow. So I thought it was important that this first lecture, we differentiate what is wrist, what is radial ulnar, and what is elbow. Okay? But it can look a lot of different ways. How are we feeling so far? Okay? Y'all like practice questions? Good? All right, let me give you another one. This one will be on the test too, I think. I haven't written it yet. Position. One of the things I try to emphasize to my students, position. Where are you at? Okay? Position. Let's do position of the wrist, position of the elbow, position of the radial ulnar joint. And feel free to write it down. Feel free to memorize it. Feel free to take a picture. Guys, I'm 47 years old. I don't care anymore. You can take as many pictures as you want. Just Photoshop it, please, if you don't mind. Give me that solid. Okay, start. Okay, watch this. It's gonna be fun. I feel like Usher. Watch this. Watch this. Is that what he did? Was that Usher? No, so dumb, bro. No cap. Did I even use that right? No, dude, my sons say stuff all the time. Try to keep up with it. I gotta join TikTok just to find out what the heck they talking about. All right, here we go. Start, finish. Now, this is what I'm hoping. I'm hoping you may be like, dude, no way. And then I'm hoping you're like, wait, if I establish where everything is at, he could move it fast. It doesn't matter. Where is it at now? Where did it go? Start, finish. Start, finish. Start, finish. Think about that one for a second. Let's see if we can make some progress. I encourage conversation, guys. After you have an answer, I encourage, again, I can't make you, and that's okay if you shy, but I think it would really help our understanding if you ask, your neighbor, or someone behind you, someone on the side of, what'd you get? Because if you got the same thing, maybe that's awesome. If you didn't get the same thing, that allows conversation. That allows you to say, well, this is what I was thinking. This is the position, this is the new position. And maybe it's you or maybe your friend be like, oh, okay, I see that. Now I agree with you. That's how learning happens, in my opinion. How many of you play cards? Anybody play cards? Just, I'm not talking like gambling stuff, but just play cards. There's 52 cards in a deck, but there's a lot of different games and there's dang near infinitely many hands you can play, right? So the more you play, the better you get. I know it's so, I know there's a want to memorize stuff. I get it. But one of the reasons I'm teaching you this method is because in the real world, sport, activity, the people you're going to work with, there's infinitely many ways to make things look certain ways with people. Some of you are going to be working with people with amputations and with prosthetic legs and with children and older adults. And there's such a spectrum that we can't just memorize every hand you ever going to get in the card game, right? I just have to teach you how to play. And then once you know how to play, then you can take those strategies of playing this card game and apply it to the infinitely many scenarios you're going to have in the real world. And the more you play, the better you get at it, right? So that's what we're doing in here. We're playing. We're playing. All right. Where's my wrist? Position. Good. Flexed. That's okay. Flexed. But here, you know what's great about it? That's okay. What I love about it is you're not afraid to say anything. And even if you got it wrong, you were looking at your finish, but even if you got it wrong, who cares? We're not taking points off right now. I'd rather get it wrong here than on the test. My wrist is flexed. What about my radial ulnar joint? Good. My radial ulnar joint has nothing to do with my wrist. So if I wanted to, I could bring my wrist back to anatomical position. That doesn't change anything about my radial ulnar joint. Radial ulnar joint doesn't have anything to do with my elbow. If I wanted to, I could put my elbow in anatomical position. That doesn't change my radial ulnar joint. Does that better help to see how the radial ulnar joint is prone? Okay. I could do the same thing for my wrist. Wrist has nothing to do with the radial ulnar joint. Put it back to anatomical. Wrist has nothing to do with the elbow. Anatomical and flexed. Could do that. I start here and I do this. My wrist is now extended. Yes. How does my wrist go from being flexed to being extended? I have to have extension. I have to. What's my radial ulnar joint? Supine. Yeah, it's supinated. It's supinated, but it was pronated. So the only way to go from being pronated to being supinated is to have. You see how we play in this game? Guys, human motion happens faster than what our eyes can process. So if I can teach you to see clues, where am I at? Where did I go? You don't have to stress about someone doing something too fast. Because you have enough information to say, I started off flexed, now I'm extended. I started off prone, now I'm supine. So this is what happened. It just happened at the same time. My wrist did this and this. You see, I got to the same place? Or you could look at it, my wrist did this and that. It just did those two things at the same time. So it looks weird, or it looks funny, or it looks like something didn't move. But this happened at the same time as this. And thus, those two things look like this. It's like taking an Etch-a-Sketch. And you have one knob that goes up and down, and you have one knob that goes left and right, but when you move them at the same time, it makes loop-de-loops. You don't have a loop-de-loop knob on the Etch-a-Sketch. It's two independent knobs that when they work at the same time, it can look a certain way. But on the first day of class, if I'd have said, what's this? You'd probably been like me on the first day of class. There's no way I'm going to see that. But you can see it. Where am I at? Where did I go? And how did I have to move to get there? Make sense? Any questions? We did a lot today. But I think it was productive. All right, we're good? All right, you guys, y'all have a great day.